I just want to let everybody know straight off the bat that we will be recording it and putting it on YouTube. So we just have to let everyone know that. But I can begin my introduction. So welcome to the 18th session of Mapping Global Populism, which is a panel series organised by the European Centre for Populism Studies. My name's Molly. I'm a research intern with ECPS at the moment. And I've really enjoyed following along with all the different manifestations of populism all across the globe. It's brilliant. So as a bit of background, ECPS curates this panel series, which is aimed at dissecting the diverse manifestations of populism across the world. Following the successful conclusion of our 8-session Mapping European Populism panels, we've embarked on a journey to explore populism and authoritarianism beyond the confines of Europe by expanding our panel series to encompass a global perspective. So our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism and authoritarianism worldwide, featuring these monthly sessions. Today we'll have our 18th session of the Mapping Global Populism series, which will examine populism and autocracy in the Gulf countries. Again, just to let everyone know, this will be uploaded on YouTube, and we're going to have a report of the panel as well, so that if anyone needs to refer back, that will be disseminated as kind of a reference for scholars, kind of wider audience, everybody. So yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce the moderator and kind of our panelists, and then I'll hand over to Courtney Freer afterwards to kind of moderate the panel. So today our panel will be moderated by Dr. Courtney Freer, who is the Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Emory University and Senior Fellow at Emory Centre for the Study of Law and Religion. Dr. Freer previously served as Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her academic work focuses on the domestic politics of the Arab Gulf states, particularly the political role of religion and Islamism more broadly. She received her DPhil in politics from the University of Oxford in 2015, having written a thesis examining the socio-political role played by Muslim Brotherhood groups in Kuwait, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. The findings of this work were published by Oxford University Press in 2018 as Rentier Islamism, the Influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gulf Monarchies. She previously has also worked at Brookings Doha Center in Qatar and the US Saudi Arabian Business Council in Washington, D.C. even. Dr. Thomas Demmelhuber will be our first speaker today to discuss key drivers of autocratization in the Gulf region. He's a professor of Middle East politics and society at the Friedrich-Alexander-University, Erlangen-Nürnberg, and visiting professor at the College of Europe. He has been researching the Middle East and its transregional entanglements for more than 2 decades and has lived and worked in different countries with substantial fieldwork experience all across the region. As PI and co-PI, he has so far been awarded with more than 5 million euros in research grants. Dr. Demmelhuber has advised different German ministries, the European Parliament, including the Subcommittee on Human Rights, and various foundations. He's serving in different scientific advisory councils, including the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin and the German Orient Institute in Beirut. Dr. Demmelhuber is also a board member and honorary secretary of the German Middle East Studies Association, and he publishes regularly in leading international journals, for example, in Democratization and in Third World Quarterly, and has published and edited numerous books, including the comprehensive volume on authoritarian gravity centers, a cross-regional study of authoritarian promotion and diffusion, which presents cutting-edge findings on the international dimension of authoritarianism. Moving on to our second speaker, Dr. Gail Buttorff will be presenting on the topic, The Evolving Social Contract in the GCC. She's a research associate professor at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, as well as associate director at the Centre for Public Policy. She joined the Hobby School as a visiting assistant professor in 2017 and holds a PhD and MA in political science from the University of Iowa. Her research interests focus on elections and gender and public policy in the Middle East and Gulf Cooperation Council countries, mainly using quantitative and survey methodologies. She is the author of Authoritarian Elections and Opposition Groups in the Arab World, and her work has also been published by Electoral Studies, the Journal of Theoretical Politics, and by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, among others. Our third speaker is Dr. Thomas Zumbraegel, who is a senior researcher and lecturer at the Department for Human Geography at Heidelberg University. Prior to this, he worked at the Centre for Excellence, Climate, Climatic Change and Society at the University of Hamburg, where he's also an associate fellow. He studied history, political science, and Middle Eastern studies in Cologne, Tübingen, and Cairo, and holds a PhD from the Friedrich-Alexander-University, Erlangen-Nürnberg. Dr. Zumbraegel is the author of Political Power and Environmental Sustainability in Gulf Monarchies, and his main research focuses on questions of legitimacy, power, and state authority in the Middle East, with a special interest in political ecology, energy policy, sustainability, and political economy. Today, Dr. Zumbraegel will talk on the new green autocrats, how Saudi Arabia and the UAE redefine environmental leadership. Moving on, Mr. Kardo Rached will be our fourth speaker presenting on the topic, the role of Salafism in the national and international politics of Gulf monarchies. Mr. Rached is a lecturer at the University of Human Development in Sulaymaniyah and director of the Quality Assurance at UHD also. He's also a manager of Turkish Studies Unit at Spain Research Centre. He's published various research articles, more recently, State Reconstruction, Iraq after ISIS as a case study in 2023, financing of non-state armed groups in the Middle East, Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces as a case study in 2022, institutionalizing the Salafi thoughts by the state, the Saudi Salafism as a case in 2021, United States, a review of the US Middle East policy from Harry Truman to Bill Clinton in 2021 as well, and post-ISIS era and state dissolution in the Middle East, Iraq as a case in 2020. The panel's fifth and final speaker is Dr. Christian Smith-Dewan, who will deliver her presentation on populism in Gulf monarchies, suppression, cooptation, adoption. Dr. Dewan is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Recent publications include The New Industries, Tourism and Entertainment in a Changing Saudi Arabia, which was published in The Economy of Saudi Arabia in the 21st Century in 2024, and Clerical Associations in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Soft Power Competition in Islamic Politics in 2021. Dr. Dewan was previously an assistant professor at the American University School of International Service and has held visiting scholar positions at George Washington University as well. Our sixth scheduled speaker, excuse me, Dr. Rabia Naguib, who is expected to deliver her presentation today, can't join us. She was going to talk about women's empowerment in the GCC, but unfortunately is unable to join. So we'll just have those five panelists speaking today. And as a reminder for everybody, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can write questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand. I'm sure that Courtney will figure that out for you as well at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Courtney Freer, who will provide more of an overview of the panel subject matter and administer the panel and all the presentations as well.
Thank you so much. Good morning from Atlanta, and thank you to the European Center for Populism Studies for having me and having the rest of the panelists here today. I think this is a really exciting discussion, and it's also it will be a really enriching discussion that will be also a wonderful distraction from all the grading that I know a lot of us are busy with right now. So thank you so much. I've taught a lot about populism in recent years, and we tend to think about populism largely in a Western context. A lot of the literature that I bring into my classes comes from Latin America. Of course, in recent years, we've seen a lot more discussion ranging on the rise of populism in Europe and the United States, and the ways in which populism interacts with authoritarianism. And I think it's really important to bring in the Gulf states into this conversation about populism. I think we've seen in the past uncomfortably large number of years that I've been looking at the Gulf, an explosion of scholarship in this field in particular. I think in the past, gone are the days when we would just talk about political economy. We would just talk about oil wealth when we were looking at the Gulf. Now we have all of these scholars on this panel doing really meaningful work, digging into the ways in which politics, society, economy, religion all interact within the Gulf states and create an environment which is really wonderful to study, to study a variety of different types of movements. And so I'm very excited about all of this and about using the Gulf as a means of understanding populism potentially in a different way and affecting the ways in which we define and think about populism more generally. So we're going to be talking throughout the panel about a variety of different topics, about the drivers of autocratization, about the changing social contract within the Gulf, about green autocrats, about the role of Salafism, about the ways in which Gulf states suppress, co-opt, and adopt populism as well. And I know that you all didn't come here to see me speak, so I'm just going to leave you with 3 questions before I hand over to the panelists, just kind of as a means, as a jumping off point, I suppose. One of the great things about being a moderator is I can throw out these questions without actually having to answer them. So I guess the first is, can religion, environmentalism, changes to the social contract, all of which will be discussed in this panel, can they be used as a means of changing authoritarian regimes or changing the ways in which regimes interact with their citizens? Secondly, how has populism in its interactions with authoritarianism changed or continues to change in the Gulf? And is this interaction any different qualitatively in the Gulf than in other parts of the Middle East, or when we look at the interaction between authoritarianism and populism in the West? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how does studying the Gulf affect our perceptions of populism or our definitions of populism? I think that bringing in different case studies, country case studies, is extremely valuable in understanding large concepts. I've tried to do this with my work on Islamism, and I think that we can do the same when we bring in the Gulf states into this conversation about populism. So with that, I will turn over to our speakers. They have 15 minutes each. We have one fewer speaker than expected, so we're not on a time crunch, but I will try to be as strict as possible. But I'm really excited to hear all of their presentations. We will start with Dr. Demmelhuber.
So many thanks, Courtney. Many thanks, Bülent. Many thanks to all the organizers who made that happen. It's really great to be on this panel. And I prepared 2.5, I have to say, 2.5 slides. And I'm going to share with you the slides in a second before beginning with my talk. And I hope it works so you can see the first slide of my 2.5 slides. So once again, thanks for having me on the panel. And as Courtney just mentioned, I think we're going to have an inspiring debate on the role of populism in the region. And I think this debate is also overdue, that we are trying to put together this very vivid and vividly debated scholarly concept of populism together with Gulf studies through the lens or through the approach of authoritarianism. And I think this fits perfectly well to what Courtney just mentioned, or the 3 questions Courtney has given us as kind of an homework for the Q&A or for our specific talks. I think as a caveat, we can all agree that the content, the scope, and the modes of populism are really different and depend on the specifics of the underlying political order we are dealing with. And I think it still remains a lacuna, and that's why it's so important to talk about this issue, because we still can't really explain this variance, how it all goes together, different modes of autocratization with populism, etc. And so it's certainly not enough to argue that populism in autocracies is dependent on the scope of the electoral arena. It would be oversimplistic to say the more you have on the electoral dimension, the more you have kind of a corridor for populist actors to move forward with their populist narratives. I think this is oversimplistic, and I think we also need a more fine-grained picture of that. But nonetheless, I think this is not the primary homework I got for my first talk. So I was asked to say a few words on the drivers of autocratization, the underlying or the enabling conditions of autocratization in the Gulf region. And what I will do in the next couple of minutes, I'll try to present 3 drivers of autocratization. And I try to connect these 3 drivers of autocratization with the domestic level, the regional level, and the international level. And I have to stress right at the beginning that I consider these 3 levers as very porous. I do not consider them as closed containers or whatsoever. So there is actually, they are on a spectrum and they have an impact on each other. And this is something we have to keep in mind when talking about these key drivers later on. But nonetheless, before starting with my key drivers, I'd like to share with you 2 important premises that constitute kind of a springboard, or the springboard for my arguments on the drivers of autocratization in the Gulf region. And my first premise would be, and this is probably something we all agree on, this is something we can take out of different data sets, VDEM, Polity4, Freedom House, or whatsoever, whatever you'd like to take, that the Gulf monarchies, the 6 members of the GCC we are talking this afternoon, they exhibit a clustering of autocratic governance. So there is kind of a cluster of authoritarianism, but, and this is a wrong perception, and you can read it once again and again in some parts of the literature. This does not imply that these political orders are static. No, the opposite is the case. Gulf political orders are in a permanent process of adaptation due to domestic stress factors, regional context factors, international stress factors, and this is something I think we have to go into this afternoon, due to specific enabling conditions for these political orders to adapt to these stress factors. And my second premise is actually just the starting point for 3 additional premises, if you wish, or sub-premises. We are now witnessing, I think, for the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, we are witnessing a very vivid development of this scholarly conceptualization of autocratization that definitely goes beyond this literature on authoritarianism, this literature on autocracies. And this broader literature on autocratization, as we have been witnessing it, goes beyond, or is quite different from the seminal literature on autocracies in the 90s and the 2000s or whatsoever. And why is it so different, or where is the added value for our scholarly work on the Gulf monarchies? I would say by embarking on the literature on autocratization, we can see more. We can see more due to 3 factors. We can get more clarity because the literature on autocratization allows us to go beyond this rather narrow binary logic of ideal typical regime types. We can move beyond this awkward democracy versus autocracy debate that led to nothing. We were actually stuck in the debate how we can conceptualize the gray zone in between. This was definitely no added value. And this literature on autocratization helps us to understand authoritarian populism as one of several overlapping trends that go all across the regime spectrum. These are trends we can see in democracies, liberal democracies, in electoral democracies, in electoral autocracies, in closed autocracies. So this is a phenomenon we can see independent of the regime type. And that's why this is a conceptual appetizer or a conceptual springboard for us to really build our epistemological approach on the literature of autocratization. And I mean, just to make it more visible, if you just look at the figure taken out of the VDEM report, these different types of autocratization, you can see that we can encompass actually 3 sub-processes under the umbrella of autocratization. So we can actually grasp the erosion of liberal elements in a liberal democracy. So for example, let me give you an example. Autocratization processes in the US, shrinking spaces of contentious politics, leading to a shrinking corridor of liberal elements in the political order. But this is still something that is taking place within the functioning setting, the institutional setting of a democracy. Then we may have a pathway of democratic breakdown, where, for example, a democracy is actually breaking down and falling behind this democratic order, falling into a autocratic setting, something we can see vividly if we look at Tunisia since Kais Saied becoming president in 2019. But this umbrella of autocratization also encompasses a process that autocracies are also adapting, that autocracies, for example, are getting more autocratic or vice versa. So this is actually the added value to grasp all these different processes under one umbrella concept and giving us the opportunity to understand common denominators regarding phenomena that are actually visible in democracies and autocracies alike. And the third and last, as I would say, added value we can take out of this conceptualization of autocratization is that we can get a better understanding of this very vivid interplay between endogenous factors and exogenous factors. And I can say at this point, in my research, in my approach to Gulf politics, I always go for an endogenous first approach. We shouldn't overestimate the exogenous factors. Of course, I will tell you later on how I will try to conceptualize the international arena. But to make a long story short, at this moment, I would say, don't forget the importance of endogenous factors when trying to understand autocratization processes, not only in the Middle East, but all across the globe where we are seeing this autocratization trend. So then let me come to my drivers. My first driver, which is actually dealing with the domestic level, I would argue that political orders in the Gulf are shaped by dynamic and vivid discourses, including domestic playbooks on regime consolidation, etc. And my suggested takeaway for this driver is that much of the mainstream literature is dealing with material factors. Much of the mainstream literature is dealing with repression, cooptation, output legitimation, etc., as a justification or as an explanatory factor why autocracies are successfully adapting to changing stress factors or whatsoever. From my perspective, I think we are actually, in order to get the full picture, I think we have to go beyond this material dimension, and we should also encompass in our research the non-material dimension around emotion, around affect, around identity management, which constitutes, in my reading, a tremendous scholarly field, and the journey has just begun. I think we still have to do a lot in order to grasp this really vivid field of regime adaptation. And just to give you an example, for example, in a recent article in the Third World Quarterly, we've shown how repertoires of the past, historical crises or trauma, etc., they serve as a toolbox to form a collective we identity. And I mean, just to give you one specific case, we all know how the Emir of Qatar has actually presented himself successfully as the father of the nation, who navigated Qatar through the crisis, etc. And if you go to the National Museum in Doha these days, and you're actually going to the last room of the National Museum, you see how this is actually presented as part of the national memory. And it's not only presented as a top-down story, no, it's presented as a shared story of memory, how the populace has actually managed to go through this crisis together with the Emir. And this is actually, I think, a fascinating field of research. I think we have to go deeper in that to understand this non-material dimension in processes of autocratization. My second driver is actually going to the regional level, if you wish. This second driver is actually a little bit self-explaining. Of course, we all know from the literature that political orders are learning from each other. They promote authoritarian practices, ideas, and norms. They even share similar mindsets of a regional regime identity. And I think the literature has offered us much how to better understand these processes that also leads to a clustering of autocratic practices. But my suggested takeaway for this driver is that we should even more focus on how this is actually done beyond the unit of analysis around the national state. And I think we can take much of the work of Malise Glasius, who is actually arguing that authoritarianism these days is more on governance over people than on territoriality. So authoritarian practices rest on a conception of the state as a collection of people to be governed more than as a territorial entity. And here I think it's definitely an inspiring avenue of research for future scholarly work to look more on this transnational dimension of how the regional dimension is also setting up a fertile ground for autocracies to adapt to changing context factors, stress factors, etc. And I see that I don't have so much time anymore, so I move on to my third driver in order to bring these three elements together and to give it a convincing narrative. So when we talk about the international level, and I also said it right at the beginning that I always have the feeling that many parts of the literature overestimate the impact of the international dimension. And I think we should, of course, include the international dimension in our research designs, etc. International networks facilitate the traveling of autocratic practices, ideas, etc. But nonetheless, I would strongly argue that these great power rivalry, the shifts on the international order, the liberal international order, all these tectonic changes in the liberal international order are not an explanatory factor, but they are an intervening factor, an intervening variable that only becomes an explanatory factor once it is translated into the domestic arena by the politically relevant elite. So to make a long story short, international arena matters, international politics matters, but it's only an intervening factor. It becomes an explanatory factor once the politically relevant elite actually translate that into the domestic setting, into the domestic into the domestic arena of autocratization. And in order to give you some circumstantial evidence, we did one study on Tobias was also part of the paper in which we tried to deconstruct the elite networks between China and the United Arab Emirates during the pandemic. And we were really able to trace this traveling of autocratic innovation. We could see how the United Arab Emirates successfully learned from surveillance techniques from China, how they actually were able to professionalize their take on internet and digital surveillance, etc. So this would be one of these research avenues where we can see the impact of the international arena on regional and domestic levels of autocratization. 1 minute left. I come to an end, and I'd like to summarize maybe 3 takeaways from my perspective on the key drivers of autocratization in the Gulf. My first suggested takeaway would be that we must understand and we must perceive autocratization as a broader conceptual setting that transcends regime type specifics. So we can beyond this awkward democracy versus autocracy thinking. Second, autocratization stands for a very broad phenomena that may be found all across the regime spectrum, and populism is only one of them. So populism is only one phenomenon of many phenomena that may be found all across this regime spectrum. But, and this is probably the starting point for our research, for all of us, we are still lacking an understanding of the causal mechanisms. What is actually the consequence of what? And I think we still have to do much more research to better understand that. And my educated guess, and with this educated guess, I will close my short talk. My educated guess tells me that first, we should focus much more on immaterial or non-material factors of regime survival. And second, we should go for a much more politics from below perspective. I think we are still caught in a bias focusing too much on elite capital nation state stuff, and we are losing, I think, a little bit the perspective from the perspective of the rights holders, from local politics, from the politics from below. And with this suggestion for future research, I finish my talk, and I'm looking forward for the Q&A. But first of all, I'm looking forward to the other talks of my dear colleagues in the panel. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I love your suggestion to focus more on immaterial factors of regime survival and also the politics from below. And I think this panel is a good way to start that focus and that kind of shift. So now we're going to switch to Dr. Gail Buttorff, who's going to talk about the shifting social contract in the Gulf. So I will hand it over.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the evolving social contract in the GCC. And, oops, sorry, I would be remiss if I did not mention my brilliant colleagues and co-authors in this broader project that we've been working on about gendering the social contract. Narwa Al-Lawati at Sultan Qaboos, Victoria Hightower, University of North Georgia, and Bojina Welburn at Smith College. So I am just the vessel here. Definitely what I'm saying is mine alone here. So we've been working on this project looking at rentierism, labor nationalization, social contracts, female labor force participation, and what that might mean for the social contract in the GCC. And first off, forgive me, my fellow panelists, so you all are very familiar with this, but for any audience members that aren't, the social contract in the GCC, when we understand social contracts, it's either this explicit or implicit agreement between the regimes, the rulers, and the citizens. In the GCC, this has meant the redistribution of the hydrocarbon wealth to establish very generous welfare states in exchange for political quiescence. And this has taken the form of jobs in the public sector, generous benefits, subsidies, including electricity subsidies, and of course, education and healthcare. And one important feature of sort of the older social contracts was that it was really about the state having substantial obligations to the citizens. And from this, the jobs, generous benefits, subsidies, education, and healthcare. And now just taking a brief step back is, of course, social contracts and populism have gone hand in hand throughout the Middle East and North Africa, including in the GCC, which we had what Heinbusch would call the populist social contracts in much of the rest of the Middle East, which came under pressure earlier than those in the GCC. So, as elsewhere, the sort of the original social contracts are under pressure and have been under pressure for the last decades, in part because of growing population, rising unemployment, especially among youth, declining oil rents, lower revenue, right? The regimes and their ability to continue these social welfare distribution depends, of course, on the price of oil, and also you have higher redistributive costs in general. And one important point about the growing population is that if in a couple of decades, if regimes don't sort of diversify their economies or especially introduce more sort of green or renewable energy, right? Most of the oil rents would be consumed by domestic electricity production. So there's a clear need that they need to diversify their economies away from oil and other hydrocarbons. And this has meant a renegotiation of the social contract. And part of this is the labor nationalization policies, which was, one of the ways that the regimes have redistributed oil wealth is through jobs in the public sector. Of course, because of the declining oil revenues and the fluctuations in oil prices, regimes have in the GCC have been undertaking what are known as labor nationalization policies, which aim to increase the presence of citizens in both the public, but specifically in the private sector, which was really dominated by expatriate workforces. And these labor nationalization policies sort of take a variety of forms, but in general, it is to incentivize and or compel private companies to hire nationals and citizens, GCC citizens. And one of the reasons, or sort of one of the benefits of this, is that states can claim higher citizen employment, recapture income, and of course raise living standards. And what we have shown in previous work is that, and others have as well, that the citizen women were particularly well placed to benefit from labor nationalization, and they have. And so this also has implications for the renegotiation of the social contract. Okay, and then we had in the early aughts and in the last decade, the release of these vision statements across the GCC. And in some ways, these vision statements were, of course, laying out plans for diversification, economic development, human capital development, and so on. But it was also seen as this renegotiation of the social contract and outlining what that social contract should be rather than what it is. And an important difference in the sort of the newer social contracts, and specifically through these vision statements, is that there is an emphasis on citizens having a duty to serve, emphasizing this a mutuality between citizens and the regime, and citizens' personal responsibility, right? This is, of course, part of the labor nationalization, is that you have a duty to serve, and sort of you have personal responsibility as well. And of course, this makes a much more explicit agreement of the social contract, and it is laid out in a much more transparent way than we saw in the past. And just to give you an example, right? So for the Saudi Arabia, the National Vision 2030, the female participation in the workforce, their aim was to get to 30%. And have also just general labor nationalization of, by 2024, 25% of the Saudization of engineering jobs, 100% of postal, and so on. Okay, and so what these vision statements were emphasizing is, of course, these labor nationalization goals, okay, and emphasis on goals and not necessarily that goals that have been met, but also they were emphasizing or sort of explicitly referring to the women citizens as well. And importantly, despite the heavy costs from the COVID-19 pandemic, GCC countries continued passing nationalization plans and laws both during and post COVID-19. Okay, and sorry. So this is an important, or sort of we find it's a pretty interesting graph of looking at sort of the increasing role of women in the labor force and how they might be renegotiating their role in the social contract. So what we see here is like the Saudi distribution of many women in the labor force, and importantly, we want to point out that this graph, this line here, is where you see a large increase of women in the private sector, and it corresponds to a big decrease of women in the public sector. So importantly, part of this evolving social contract has meant that employment now is what GCC citizens really see as the bedrock of the social contract today. The sense of GCC citizenship is now primarily tied to jobs. And we've done some focus groups in Oman, and these individuals, these are just a few snapshots, have sort of repeated this, or sort of have also highlighted this idea that employment is seen by both men, and importantly women, that you have a right to work. And here are some of the examples of the legislation and social contract. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we had labor laws that were meant to safeguard citizens' employment rights, ensure that job security was at the forefront of the social contract, regardless of the economic situation. During this time, employees could terminate expat workers, but not citizens. Citizens were either fully immune, or termination was only acceptable after particular measures were taken. Primarily, this helped ensure that citizens had a sense of job security, and that the states were putting its citizens at the forefront, despite the economic and the health crisis underway. And some specific examples we had for both men, sort of gender-specific examples during the COVID-19 pandemic, but then also non-gender specific. So, for example, in both Bahrain and the UAE, said that all working mothers in the government could work from home. So, didn't matter in the public sector, and same thing in the UAE. They allowed for working from home for both pregnant women and mothers, right? And then in the UAE, another example of non-gender specific, that the termination bylaws was passed to apply to expats, but not to nationals. And again, the broad conclusion is that they had. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a message in chat. I must be almost out of time. Okay, sorry. Okay, and so I'll finish it, but basically we have sort of, again, the emphasis on this evolving social contract. During the COVID-19 pandemic, to us, it meant, in previous periods of, oil price drops, we've seen a decline in female labor force participation and the de-emphasis of the importance of women in the labor market. But surprisingly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we didn't see this, right? There was some gender-specific and then non-gender specific legislation passed to ensure both citizens continued to have that right to employment, as well as women. And so I'll just skip that, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And then finally, we get to the gendering the social contract, and we know, right, there have been measures undertaken to renegotiate the social contract with all citizens, but specifically with women nationals, and we can see this as a measure to enhance both legitimacy and survival. We've also seen GCC states adopt policies to improve the presence of women in public life, in politics, right, with quotas, high-level minister appointments, and also reference to gender equality in visions and strategies. And importantly, we also see, and my co-author, Dr. Alawati, has looked at this as part of her dissertation research, is that it is not just men that are sort of making demands now on the government, but women are too. They're just doing it in different ways. And so I'll end there. Sorry for going over time.
Sorry, no, you're good. You're good on time. I was just, it seemed like someone couldn't hear the panel, but hopefully everyone is all good on volume and hearing everyone. So yeah, thank you so much. I think it's great to bring in the gendered aspect of the social contract, which is of course not something that's static in the Gulf states, though it's often been kind of presented like that in the literature, at least in the past. So now we are going to turn to Dr. Tobias Zumbraegel, who will talk about green autocrats.
Yeah, thank you so much also from my side. I also have prepared some slides I would like to share. And what I can already mention is that I'm super grateful for Gail to also introduce already the social contract, because this will also be my kind of point of departure in trying to explain a little bit the underlying dynamics that we can see here with regard to well, the Gulf states, the petro states, or the oil and gas exporting countries turning green now. So basically, and Gail, as mentioned before, I mean, you have already mentioned the work of Markus Löwe and other colleagues here from the German IDOS institution in Bonn, you can in a very simplistic way, but try to understand the social contract as based on 3 pillars of participation, of provision of services, and then the protection of citizens. And for that, citizens pay taxes and, getting a belief into the regime's legitimacy. So that's actually in a very simplified way, something how you can also understand the underlying contract, the implicit and explicit contract between a ruler and ruled people. If we are looking into the Gulf states, I would argue that the picture looks a little bit different here. We have, not really an inclusive and participatory approach, but we have, based on the rentier system that has been fed by the oil and gas rents for decades, a stronger dominance of the other 2 pillars, which are also, as Thomas has mentioned in his first presentation, also I would argue more porous here. So there is actually the understanding that protection and provision comes together and should be here seen as mutually constitutive. So when we are looking a little bit into the characteristics now of this kind of new Green Gulf model, and let me say this as also as a background, we had this situation that for some time these Gulf states were much occupied in terms of trying to avoid any adjustments to their oil and gas business, which have made them rich and influential. But over the last almost 10 to 20 years, we can see that there is actually a paradigm shift here. So there's a deeper understanding that some things need to change and we need to adapt to new realities, which is also in correspondence to what Thomas has said. So it's not static. We have a certain adjustment here. And even going a step further, I would argue it's not only adjustment, it is really a proactive way in influencing global climate governments and policies here. If we are looking into this kind of model and based on the social contract, as explained before, we can see that there are some certain characteristics which are important for the Gulf states to promote their green growth model. It is, as the political setup is also suggests, it is very centralized. It is very personalistic. So it is based on the action of a few people. It is not really inclusive and participatory, so it is really more like a top-down approach here that is not really informed by a broader societal demand, which is a little bit untypical to other sustainability developments that we have seen in the rest of the world. Since the 70s, we have seen that bottom-up approaches had actually been the starting point for green movements here, and they have actually shaped climate and environmental policies for a long time. In the Gulf states, it's a little bit the other way around. So we can see that it is actually some smart and wise people at the government trying to initiate this kind of shift. This shift actually is then also based on a highly techno-utopian vision, which should also not come as a surprise when looking into the government model in itself from the Gulf states, which is very much a modernization project since the oil boom. It is a development project. We only have to imagine and remember some things like the Dubai model, and this always better, faster, harder, bigger model. So doing the impossible, and now they are doing this more in a sustainable and green way. But it is still based on this techno-utopian belief system in the Gulf states. Another point, and if you have paid some attention to the last climate summits, then you can see that there's a strong emphasis of we still need fossil fuels in a climate-constrained world, while the majority of countries in the world trying to turning away from fossil fuels, these Gulf states are actually arguing that there is still a role for fossil fuels, and I will later explain in a short moment why this is the case. But of course, they are not willing to give up their business that have made them, well, rich and influential. And another point is that hasn't been really explored, and I can only touch upon this here, but I found it very interesting that you should not really look into sustainability as one policy field in isolation, but it really stretches out to a lot of other sectors in the whole economic diversification aspect. So it transcends to what Gail has actually said about job creation and trying to provide more and new jobs for broader parts of the society. But we can also see a huge alignment here with the hyperactive involvement into the sports sector. So you only have to remember that Saudi Aramco has been now the biggest sponsor of the FIFA as an organization. So you can see that there are already kind of many alignments. Saudi Aramco is also sponsoring the Formula Uno, and they want to make that, to make the whole sports sector net zero until 2030. So actually there are a lot of commonalities here where they are trying to bring a nexus to also other parts and other sectors they are interested in here. So you could also speak of a sports sustainability nexus, for instance. So in general, and this is also where I agree with what has been already said. So the general social contract has become under pressure by the non-human world, so by climate change and environmental degradation, and by the consequences of drilling oil and gas for a long time with a massive degree of pollution. But we can also see that this the social contract has become under pressure because of policy decisions by humans, like the Paris Agreement, heavier costs on fossil fuels. And this needs then has led to a rethinking how actually the Gulf states can be still relevant in a climate constrained world by also being very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So really targeting these kind of two pillars of protection and provision at the same time. So they need to be creative in terms of how to cope with these kind of, mostly exogenous and external drivers and pressures. And they are doing this, as mentioned before, by trying to betting on what I would say immature technologies. This is definitely debatable because we know from scientists and from climate reports like the IPCC that actually we need ideas like carbon capture and storage, and we need ideas of carbon sequestration because they will actually be also a solution to the climate crisis. But we can see that there's a strong dominance in the Gulf states that this is actually kind of the silver bullet here, and it's a perfect exit to still rely on fossil fuels, but just make them clean. So here we do have a narrative that they try to brand the idea of clean fossils by also not really mentioning all the other negative consequences and uncertainties that are surrounded by ideas like carbon capture and storage here the acronym of CCS, and direct air capture, where you're trying to capture the emissions from the air. So all these things come with a lot of problems, social, ecologically, economically, but they are still promoted as the only solution from the Gulf states, which makes sense when looking into why and from where they are coming from, and that they still want to use selling oil and gas as long as it's lucrative. At the same time, they're expanding domestic alternative energy sources, especially solar and wind. This also is used for freeing up more oil and gas to export and trying to get as much rents as possible in a world that is slowly shifting away from fossil fuels, but still trying to get the rents they can have with it. We can also see, and most prominently, this has been happened in Dubai last year during the COP, that they are influencing international climate agreements in their favor. We have also seen that the Arab group led by Saudi Arabia has blocked a veto of shifting away from fossil fuels. So they really want to stick that to the narrative that fossil fuels remain important. And at the same time, and this aligns with the overall idea of economic diversification, they are tapping into fields that are fossil dependent, but where fossil fuels are needed. So, but could be manufactured like petrochemicals and so on. So there's also an idea of relevance. All this is actually happening by a robust alliance of already established networks that have been established during, over the last decade. So we can see that actually, and surprisingly, national oil and gas companies are very active here in this field of clean transformation. We have the state-owned sovereign wealth funds who are doing and funding most of the projects. And we have a lot of newcomers here that are still be part of the elitist group, and they are state affiliated or even state owned, and they are sometimes also called national champions in terms of expanding into this new field at home and also abroad. So we can see that companies, as mentioned here, like Aqua Power, Takar, Nepros Power in Qatar, and Mustard, they are not only promoting and building, constructing new clean energy plants in these countries, but also outside, and trying to also gain more influence here in this field in a lot of other regions, especially in Africa and Central Asia. So concluding here, and we can definitely expand on a lot of things here, but if we are going back to this kind of three-pillar approach, we can see that, well, broader societal demands here and information gathering and the provision of information about the status quo of sustainability is not really a factor in the Arab Gulf sustainability model so far. It is really more focused on provision and also on provision of welfare gains that have been functioning for the last century that come under pressure, but they are still trying to maintain this kind of welfare system based on a rentier state system. Although we need adjustments, but even here it is more seen like opportunities where you can create more new jobs, green jobs based on green growth. So they are really actually seeing this as opportunities here and not so much on constraints. Protection is also kind of interesting because they are justifying this kind of also in international climate agreements with the idea that, well, we are not giving up our oil and gas because this would be unjust. So they are not really talking about the emissions. They are saying that if someone, and especially the industrialized countries, saying to us that we need to get rid of oil and gas, that would be increasingly and significantly unjust for our population. So trying to have another and a kind of slightly different approach to climate justice as has been conceptualized, for instance, among climate movements and civil society agents. Also, what is interesting in terms of protection is that while these Gulf countries are actually feeling climate change quite drastically, and we only have to imagine flash floods in Dubai or Jeddah, they are still focusing much more on climate mitigation, meaning the reduction of CO2 emissions, and not so much on adaptation. So I would argue ultimately that there could be kind of a point of erosion here if they are not turning much more to climate adaptation here, because the effects of environmental degradation and climate change are already felt in the Gulf states, and this will certainly increase over the next years. So there is a potential that this kind of pillar could erode, and that would then also lead to well, an erosion to the social contract. But yeah, this is one idea what we might see over the next years. So I think I was a little bit over the time, but thank you very much also for my short outlines here.
Thank you so much. Everyone has been perfect on time. So thank you for that as well. And follows really nicely on from the discussion that Gail had about the shifting social contract and the ways in which, although we're looking at authoritarian systems, they're by no means static. We are now going to go to Kardo Kareem Rached, who will speak about Salafism in local and international politics of the Gulf. So I turn over the floor to you.
Yes, I'm going to share my slides and where is it? All right. Well, thank you very much for your invitation and thank you for all colleagues. I'm going to talk about Salafism and their role in the creation of national and international politics in the Gulf monarchies or in the Gulf states. But I think it's very important to highlight here that when we are going to speak about Salafism, so it's very important to have Saudi Arabia as a case study because I mean the birthplace for Salafism as ideology, as let's say one of the sect inside Islam can be it goes back to Saudi Arabia. So that's why we should have, or we must see the connection between the history and how it started and how it's going with the Salafism. We must go back to Saudi Arabia and not only the state, also society. How is the connection between these, let's say, Salafism and the Saudi system. So as I said, Salafism is a kind of cornerstone of Islamic Sunni. As you know, we have a Shia and Sunni, and the Sunni, the majority of them, they go back to 4 scholars, and Salafism is a kind of umbrella for Sunni Muslim. Salafism, it gets a huge attention, especially in post 11 September. That was because of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And these terrorists attacked United States of America. They came from Saudi and they were Salafist ideology. So they came from a Salafist school, and they came from a Salafist, jihadi Salafist. And here I want to say that so we need to highlight the connection, or let's say interplay between Salafism and the state on the one hand, and Salafism and the Saudi society on the other hand. And I try to highlight the role of Salafism in the creation of national and international politics in Saudi Arabia. But I need to go back to, like, let's say, to have a historical background for Salafism role in Saudi society. So as we know, it started like a marriage between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab as a mastermind for Salafism with Saudi family. So they started of the creation, or they decided to establish a state in Saudi Arabia after the name of Saudi tribal. So the beginning of Saudi state, let's say, legitimacy of the Saudi state, it goes back to Salafism. So that's very important to highlight that. Even if we look at Saudi constitutions, so they say the Saudi constitutions is based on Quran and Sunnah. And then here we have interpretation of Quran and Sunnah according to Salafism. So the state's legitimacy goes back to Salafism, or based on Salafism interpretation of Islam. That's why we see a very, very complex, a very, very difficult, or let's say very integrated relationship between Salafism and the Saudi state. Even MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he started to, let's say, make a distance between him and the Salafi ideology, but still he needs to have to keep Salafism as one of most important tool in their hand to provide the state's legitimacy. Then, as I said, I try to have a historical analytical approach. We try to see the history for that relations. They started in past, and how is today, or how was in before 9/11 September, before 11 September, and then how it can be in the future. I mean, the Salafism after 11 September, we have seen like kind of let's say kind of disagreements between the Saudi king tried to make a distance from themselves with Salafi jihadi. That's why I say we need to have that historical background for Salafism as it started in the Second World War. As I said, I think it's very important to have that information, or to have that knowledge that how is the Saudi decision-making process. I mean, still the king, he is the only man who is decided for inside the Saudi society. And we have the ruling family, the Saudi family, let's say the king family. Also, we have religious institutions. Then we have tribals, sheikhs, and army leaders. And also, of course, we have holy places like Mecca and Medina, and also U.S. ally with Saudi family. Here I have that figure. I started with one of the most important, let's say, the only man who is a king. He decided for, let's say, for the Saudi society. And then we have a ruling family and also religious institutions and so on. In compared to Algerian political system, because Algerian is not like a king, Saudi Arabia. So in compared to Algeria, we have a Liberians movement. We have a, let's say, because in past they have been against colonialism, and that ideology is one of the most political legitimacy. But that's not a case in Saudi Arabia. The only case is what is Salafism. Another one I think is very important in that part is we must to be aware of the creation of Saudi state is, I like to say that the anatomy of a rentier state. The Saudi Arabia is a rentier state, and the history of the Saudi started with very explorative. They start to they were trying to find out they were looking for natural resources in the beginning, and that in that stage, the relation between state and Salafism, it was very good, because the Salafism, they started to also support that kind of politics. Then later, after the Saudi, they found out oil, natural resources. They tried to distribute its revenue, and then they have the supported inside society. Then the Saudi changed it to be like a centralized state, and then it becomes a rentier state. And that rentier state is, let's say, the final stage of the Saudi state that we have today, and still they are supporting the idea of rentier state. Not only the state, not only the system, also the Salafism. One of the most important, I think, event in that connection between Salafism and the role of Salafism in creation of national politics is that the Saudi state tried to, or they succeed in institutionalization of Salafism. After the Second World War, as we know, Arab nationalisms, they came to power, like Jamal Abdel Nasser. And he started to export nationalism. He started to transform, or let's say, try to get Saudi to change from the kingdom to be a republic. And in order to avoid that exportation, in order to avoid nationalism. So the Saudis started to use Salafism as one of the tools in fighting nationalism, in fighting Arab nationalism. So that's why the beginning of institutionalization of Salafism and the most important role of Salafism in creation of national politics in Saudi Arabia, it goes back to post WW2. As I say, because of in fear of nationalism, Jamal Abdel Nasser's ideology, so they use Salafism as one of the tools to fight back nationalism. Not only that, the Saudi Arabia, because it was kind of conflict between Jamal Abdel Nasser and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So Saudi Arabia welcomed all Muslim Brotherhood members from Egypt, Iraq, Syria. And when they came to Saudi, they involved into Saudi society. They start to establish education system. And that was a good idea for King Faisal's visions, like modernization of Islam. He called that during that time. And he started to, let's say, use Muslim Brotherhood who left Egypt and Iraq because of nationalistic movement. They came to Saudi Arabia and they cooperated with the Salafism, and they established, or they created a new education system for Saudi society. So it was kind of a good relationship between Salafism and the state, Muslim Brotherhood and Salafism, and also the state. So there was kind of cooperation and understanding, as I say, because of nationalistic, Jamal Abdel Nasser's nationalistic ideology. And how does the Saudi succeed in using Salafism in their foreign policy? As we know, during Iranian revolutions, when Ayatollah Khomeini, he came back to Iran, and he also started to export Shia ideology. So again here, Saudi used Salafism as one of the card, as one of the supporter, as one of the legitimate tool to fight back Shia. So, and also Saudi used Salafism in the international politics to mobilize youth, to mobilize people from Muslim countries to send them to Afghanistan as a mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union during that time. So, and also they started to have, during that time, it was a Sahwa group, awakening, that kind of, let's say, called, it was a Salafism, they called Muslims to go back to Islamic value and to come back to Islamic understanding and interpretation. And the Saudi state, they supported awakening, they supported Sahwa group, and they also supported Saudi state in mobilizing people to send them to Afghanistan to fight the Mujahideen. But we have the turning point. We have new time in that relationship between Saudi and Salafism. It was when we have a new fatwa after Saddam Hussein, he occupied Kuwait. So it was kind of a fatwa called for United States to protect Saudi Arabia. So that was a turning point for Salafism, and that was being against the state because of Salafism. They didn't accept it, foreigners on the countries. The Saudis should not allow them to come to Saudi Arabia. That was kind of disagreement. It was a beginning of this agreement. This agreement goes back to the around 10, 11 years before 11 September between Saudi state and Salafism. But Salafism, Saudi state, they succeed in creation of a new group, they call them Al-Jamia or intelligence Salafism, like Salafi al-Mukhabaratiyah. That's what they called, because they say that we should not criticize ruler, we should not disobey king that is not Islamic, that is not allowed in Islam. So that was a new versions of Salafism. They came out as that's supported by Saudi regime during that time. So that was kind of very complicated, very, let's say, difficult relations between Salafism and state, not only in Saudi Arabia, also in other Gulf countries. But when I say Saudi Arabia, because that was one of the most obvious example. So, I mean, during that time, post-Gulf War in 1991, it was, let's say, it can be called post-Salafism because Saudi state changed it very radically. They tried to reduce financial aid to Islamic group, and the Saudis start to using police and force against religious teaching. And so that's why we have seen Osama bin Laden, he left again Saudi Arabia. He went to Sudan, and he was in Sudan until he came back to Afghanistan. So as a conclusion for that, I mean, even we are in post-Salafism, according to many scholars, if we look at Mohammed bin Salman, but still Salafism is one of the most important player in creation of national politics in Saudi Arabia, and also in Saudi's foreign policy. As I say, the Saudis, they succeed in creation or institutionalization of Salafism, and they succeed in creation or establishment of Al-Jamia as a new, let's say, new group of Salafism. They came out and they standing against jihadi Salafism, and they say we should not disobey king. The king, they know what is the best for us as a Muslim society. So as I said, yes, Salafism, they played a huge role, very, very essential role in creation of national politics and also in international politics. But I think still we should be aware that since 11 September, there have been, or let's say, disagreement between state, Saudi state, the king family, how best, what they need to do, how they can use Salafism again, because in Arab Spring we have seen that Saudi and Emirates, they supported Egyptian's army against Muslim Brotherhood, and they thought that Muslim Brotherhood in power can be a threat against a king's rule in Gulf monarchies. So yes, still there is a chance for involving Salafism, or let's have Salafism, they have a chance to come back into society. Even MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, tried to make a distance between him and Salafism. Finally, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So important to bring in the religious aspect of a lot of what we're talking about. And then finally, also before we turn to our last speaker, if you have any questions that you would like to put in the chat box, I encourage you to do that because after our next speaker, we will turn to Q&A. So last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Kristen Smith-Dewan, who's going to speak about suppression, co-optation, and adoption of populism.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. And I also want to give my thanks to Bülent Kenes and to the European Center for Populism Studies I've actually been long interested in this topic of populism in the Gulf states. I was shocked when I went to pull back some of my notes to prepare for this talk to see that they were dated 2019. So I've been collecting a lot of ideas about this for a long time and haven't had too many arenas to share them. So I'm really delighted to be connected with these other fantastic scholars and with the center and to share my presentation with you. I'm going to be talking kind of, I guess a lot of the other speakers have kind of taken a more peripheral approach towards populism. I'm going to take it straight on. As Courtney mentioned, my topic is populism in the Gulf monarchies. And I don't have any slides, so don't be waiting for those. I'm just going to try to be more engaging in my discussion. And I think when I look at the Gulf monarchies and why I was interested from the beginning, it's a bit surprising, no, to see.
Kristen, just a moment. Kardo, could you please stop the sharing?
Sure. Although you had quite that beautiful thank you slide at the end. I kind of
Yes, of
liked
course.
looking at it. Should I just keep talking until he does that? I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, it's fine. So anyway, it's a bit surprising, right? Almost like a least expected case when we come across populism in the Gulf states. Of course, these are very wealthy states, as everyone's mentioned. At least the old social contract did involve quite a lot of support for citizens. But yet, as I mentioned, you really do start to see bubbling up from below these evidences of populism emerging from within them a bit, as we'll talk about, unevenly across the Gulf states. But I think any of us, and I must confess I'm one of them, that spends a lot of time on social media and trying to track kind of the sense and stuff that's coming from Gulf populists. I often see these populist themes. So what I want to do in this talk, I'm going to start, because nobody's really kind of tackled it frontally, looking at different definitions of populism. I'm then going to look at some of the characteristics of how we see them in the Gulf. And then I will turn to trying to look a little bit like Tomas said, we need to look at, try to look at these explanatory mechanisms. I will try to kind of hint at why they might be appearing now. And then try to do a little bit of a categorization through examples that we see in the different Gulf states. So that's my plan moving forward. So let's start with definitions of populism. I mean, when we look at the literature, there's a lot of different ways that scholars have approached populism. One is as kind of a theory of different stages of international development, where you see populism kind of emerging as an important stage in certain times. We also just see populism used as economic policy, almost a description of a certain kind of economic policy of fiscal largesse. It's also a political form, right, of the sort of unmediated politics that's conducted differently and very closer to the people. So you can kind of characterize how it's practiced. And then finally, sometimes it's looked at as a discursive category of political rhetoric. And today I'm mostly going to be talking in this last form, kind of looking at political rhetoric, but I will try to hint at, as I mentioned, the underlying politics by putting in context who's using it and for what purpose. And so when we start to look at characteristics of populist rhetoric, I'm sure all of you these days is quite familiar with this. One is a very direct appeal to the people, appealing to them as being inherently virtuous, dutiful, perhaps disadvantaged. There's also a very powerful sense of opposition to the establishment. And of course, we'll have to think about what that establishment is and how that's defined. And it often has a very strong sense of nationalistic approach or national pride. And this is actually what initially brought me of interest to this topic because of my interest in nationalism and seeing those links with populism in the Gulf. Of course, when I'm looking at the rhetoric, this is to generate this emotive appeal. And again, going back to Tomas's idea that we should look at emotive populism very much as an emotive kind of arena or mode of discourse. you need to really define your enemies. Populism does this very well and very frequently. And often they do that. Probably the most common way we think of is hitting up, of course, against political, economic, cultural elites. But often more disregarded, but extremely important, is the way that populism also punches down, if you think of it vertically, against these undeserving, deviant, dangerous people, perhaps below them, and very much showing themselves as the virtuous. And of course, there's also this link to nationalism, where populism is punching outward of outward forces, foreigners, could be immigrants, migrant workers in the Gulf. We often see that, and this is again this strong attachment to nationalism. So if we turn to the Gulf, then the context for populism, as I said, is a bit surprising, given the relative wealth of these states and the generous income distribution. But if we look at some scholars, they have been looking at this increasing concentration of wealth to some degree. Kamrava, Noneman, Nosova, and Valeri did this really excellent study that looked at the upward shift of wealth distribution as ruling families and business elites were getting much closer together. We do see this in a number of states. I think as well, a number of our speakers, you can talk to Tobias and some of the others have hinted at, and Gail as well, of the new social programs, social contracts that are much less generous, actually, in terms of income distribution. We saw, coming from around 2016 and then into the pandemic, quite a few austerity programs being implemented, reductions in state subsidies and in government spending, especially through implementation of labor market reforms, some efforts to privatize state things, which also increases prices, often on health and education services, and pushing some of those expenses onto people. We've seen the introduction of some taxes as well. And at the same time as these new burdens, if we can call them, have been pushed on to citizens, we see the shift in communication, right, and information technologies, especially the rise of social media, which at least for some time allowed for a lot more popular discourse and popular mobilization through that social media to bring up these themes of dissatisfaction. So let me turn now to the Gulf and looking at these different kind of forms of populism that we see. The most common, of course, populist agendas come from below. I'd say these are a lot less easy to see in the wealthier Emirates of Qatar and the UAE, although you could see some nativist trends within the elected bodies in those states if you're watching closely. But they're most evident in the Arab uprisings, especially in Bahrain and Oman, where these issues of corruption and very strong rhetoric against the elite emerged. And as usual, and I know Courtney will agree with me here because I know she shares this affection for Kuwait and looking at Kuwaiti political rhetoric. Of course, Kuwait being, until recently, at least the most open political system, you can really get at a lot of this rhetoric that comes out. And we have some pivotal figures that emerged in Kuwait, such as Musalla Mubarak in the 2000s, coming from these tribal outer districts in Kuwait, that really rejected even the tribal primaries that tried to kind of contain him within a certain identity, to do a much more broader populist appeal that even briefly for a while brought in Shia and Sunni together. A really strong rhetoric, a very explicit rhetoric against the oligarchy, explicitly tying the business elites and the royal family together. And we saw this height in 2012, where he did a really blistering speech in which he pretty much attacked the emir directly. So if we look at how this was handled, of course, we have seen a pretty strong crackdown on these individuals. Although it's interesting, if you want to look at how this is managed in Kuwait, for a while we did see an attempt at sort of a co-optation, where under the previous Emir and Prime Minister Ahmed Nawaf, that's the Prime Minister, we did see a rather populist sort of work program being developed by the state and by the parliament. But now under the new Emir, after Ahmed Nawaf's death, sorry, I got this backwards, Nawaf. reverse those two names, then we see much more a return to, well, we can talk about it, a little bit more confusing, but a little bit more elite politics. We've also seen, that's an example of suppression that we saw in Kuwait. We did see some co-optation, I would say, as an example, within the parliament in Bahrain, where they kind of reoriented the parliament to try to bring in some of these voices while pushing out the Islamists. So we could talk about Kardo's presentation there, kind of excluding more the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood. They did start to bring in some of the kind of more socialist, progressive, democratic tribune parties into the parliament. For a while, Abdul Nabi Salman became actually the vice speaker of the parliament from a kind of more populist rhetoric that then got co-opted into the state in a way to counter Islamists. And then finally, and most interestingly, and this was a paper that I was working on at one time, is looking populist agendas from above. And this is very much we can see in the case of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman, where he's actually deploying populist tropes and actions to consolidate power and to push forward the state transformation. And in this way, he kind of displaces himself from the elites. And we saw this as a direct attack on business elites through the anti-corruption campaigns. If you all recall, he actually imprisoned them in a hotel at one point, seized a lot of their wealth. This is very much playing into a kind of populist rhetoric and long-standing frustration in Saudi Arabia against business elites. He also deploys this rhetoric against entrenched bureaucrats. So very much his rule is kind of put against the state or the bureaucratic state as it is and trying to reform it and transform it. And he also deployed it against Islamists. We saw Kardo just talked about that big important shift in the Saudi politics. So this kind of nationalist and more populist rhetoric was deployed against Islamists and even against women's, or at least feminists that were coordinating with people from outside powers. So very much kind of deploying that rhetoric against them. And even against other, this is more on the nationalist line, but other countries that would question sort of Saudi Arabia and its right to rule or try to intervene in Saudi domestic politics. We saw that very strongly in the Qatar pushing out, of course, of Qatar, the Qatar boycott, but it was also deployed at some point against Turkey, as well as against Canada, quite surprisingly. So you get this kind of populist rhetoric linked with a nationalist posture, which has been quite effective. So I'll close up now, just kind of give a review of my key takeaways, that we do see the surprising emergence of populism within the wealthy rentier oil monarchies, dealt with different strategies, sometimes suppression, sometimes co-optation of certain parties or individuals, sometimes adoption of the populist rhetoric. It's still relatively limited, I would say, in the wealthier monarchies, although we do see a nativist trend in those elected bodies, much more developed and wealthy Kuwait, reflecting the importance, I would say, of political space that allows populist themes to really develop from below. And finally, a very interesting case of Saudi Arabia that has really integrated populist themes into its emergent nationalism, seeking to frame it in a way that's supportive of the state transformation. And I'd say that's really a very important element that we need to understand in the Saudi transformation that I think gives it a bit more staying power, is the way that it does link into these populist themes. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the speakers. I've really enjoyed this. And I think that what we come away with is really that the Gulf as a realm to study populism is quite rich, which is something that we, those of us who work on the Gulf kind of had a hunch that this was the case, but to see the extent to which this is the case is interesting. And also to see, that some of the ways in which the Gulf is unique. I mean, we've talked about oil wealth and the reliance on oil wealth then leading to a need to diversify. need to mitigate the effects of climate change. We've also talked about the importance of the region more broadly beyond just the Gulf states in their interactions with these states. We've talked about the social contract and how it's changing, the role of religion. So it's been a very rich discussion, and I think it shows the extent to which bringing in the Gulf kind of de-exceptionalizes it in some senses, and also helps us to expand how we think about populism and how we think about populism's relationship with authoritarianism. So I have a question, but I'll start with the questions that have come in the chat first. So the first one is to Dr. Gail Buttorff. It says, you highlighted the nationalization of labor markets in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which prioritize their own nationals. Considering that many Western democracies adopt multicultural and multinational approaches to the people and citizenship, could you elaborate on how the people or citizenship is defined in GCC countries and how it differs from the frameworks in Western democracies?
Yeah, this is a great question, and anyone on this panel could answer this as well. As the idea of citizenship is defined very narrowly as, people with passports, and that is really non-negotiable. And so the bulk of at least in like countries like the UAE, the bulk of the workforce or the people living there are non-nationals, non-citizens. So it's very narrow, and that would of course be different from what you laid out in many Western countries, where it is about multicultural, multinational. There's options there's paths to citizenship for immigrants. There is some of that now, of course, in some of the Gulf states. There are paths to at least getting a passport or getting residency. I think, I'm going to let Courtney talk about Kuwait because she is an expert, but I think there you would probably see some differences in how, maybe not the regime, but how other actors understand the people. Whereas, from my perspective, we're thinking just about, the citizens very narrowly of those GCC countries.
Does anyone else from the panel want to jump in on that question about who the people are when we talk about the Gulf?
I will.
Oh, yeah.
Just at one point, because this whole question of citizenship is actually super interesting in the Gulf right now, because I would say that it's really shifting quite a bit. I think, as Gail just mentioned, this whole idea of starting to empower more outside workers. I mean, first by giving them more rights in terms of owning property, being able to own property, more extensive ideas of green cards and residency is relatively new, most developed in the UAE, but has really huge political impacts. And at one point, I'd say the strongest populist themes that came out of a country like UAE were very much against this. And the idea of kind of empowering the local people, their customs, their beliefs, very linked as well. The Islamist movements were the strongest ones in championing this. And so it's quite interesting that they, of course, had to be clamped down on before this could see its most live and kind of fruition in the state right now. Also, it's the whole idea of citizenship is shifts over time, and its links to political categories. And right now we're seeing a really strong use of withdrawing of citizenship as a way to discipline populations. We saw that quite a bit in Bahrain initially, where we saw citizenship both granted to Sunnis as a way of altering the balance within the country, and then also now more recently withdrawn from opposition, mostly Shia, to a large, a pretty amazing extent. Both of those quite strongly used. It even affected the balance of kind of the population, the demographic balance in the country. And more recently, I don't know if anyone's paying attention, but in Kuwait, so very striking now, under the new emir, withdraw citizenship from a huge number of people. That's going to have enormous impacts. So that whole idea of citizenship as a political tool is something that's really key and very important, and a very strong mechanism or tool that elites can use actually against populist movements too. So we should think about that to some extent, opposition, or to some extent people that are challenging from below. I mean, we need to work that out a bit more, but yeah. So I just want to add that. Thanks.
Anyone else from the panel want to comment on that? I would just add, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, that seeing citizenship is seen so differently in the Gulf. We also have, not all citizenships are created equal. You have original citizens, and then you have naturalized citizens as well, and there's a distinction there. And so it's all kind of mediating how quote unquote original you are kind of to the place. And as Kristen noted, we've seen, I think it's about 3,000 to 5,000 revocations of citizenship in Kuwait on the grounds that people had basically gained citizenship in an improper way or had dual citizenship. They're also restricting the right of women married to Kuwaiti, or Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaiti men to pass on citizenship. So it's quite a contested category. And I think another reason maybe to restrict those who can gain citizenship is economic. If you decrease the number of people among whom the pie is split, you are less, it's less necessary to put in place austerity measures potentially. So yeah, and then I see another question here for Kardo. It says, I have a question regarding Saudi Arabia as a rentier state. How does the ruling elite generate consent among its citizens to consolidate the autocratic monarchy and ensure its sustainability? Furthermore, how do they justify these policies in the context of Salafist/Islamist populism?
I think the environment of political system in Saudi Arabia is very difficult, because the king is the only man who is decided, who is the only ruler in the country. For example, if we look, let's say, what is the constitutions of Saudi Arabia? I don't think it's easy to find out the Saudi constitutions, because they say that constitution is based on Quran and Sunnah. So what's the Quran and Sunnah? We have different scholars in Islamic inside of Islam for interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. We have 4 scholars. We have a Sunni and Shia. We have a different kind of sects. So it's up to the king to choose one of the best interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. And then when we look at and I remember it was kind of demonstration in Bahrain. People, they ask king to have constitutional monarchy. It means they want to have constitutions to limit it, the king's power. So the power has the king has absolute power in Gulf countries. So that's why I think it's very it's very like comedian to speak about of democracy, to speak about of human rights in these countries, in these in Gulf monarchies. And regarding to Saudi Arabia, we have the relationship between people and state is like the Saudi is client society, is a clientelism. So in client society, you let's say you accept that you are not going to exercise your political rights in order to provide some social welfare, for example. That's the same in Iraq. It's the same in even in Turkey. It's the same in many countries in Middle East. But specific in Gulf state, that relations is very obvious. You don't have right to form political party. There is no kind of interesting group. Of course, we have like for example, different kind of sports club. We have and also that kind of sport. It's kind of soft power in hands of MBS and Mohammed bin Salman in order to have new faces of the king. But that's difficult to say. The Saudi people, they accept the kingdom as it is. They accept it because there is no chance. There is no chance for challenging him. If you are going challenging him, you will pay a heavy price. So that's why they accept this kind of system. The system is what we are going to accept, that we will not exercise our rights. We given up our freedom, we given up our individualism, we given up our political right in order to provide security and some social welfare. And in order to, and also we have a religion's interpretation for that. I think that's most important in creation of that relation between the monarchy, the system, and people. They try to transform, they try to make a deal between the king and people. For example, it's not allowed to disobey king. Why? Because it's not allowed in Islam. That's it. What if you do? So you will be out of Islam. And people, they know the meaning of be out of Islam in Islamic society. So you will be antisocial, you will be out of your family. So that's very, very difficult for Saudi peoples. If they are going to disobey the king. So that's why I think it's very, very complicated relations between Saudi state, king, Mohammed bin Salman, if we say that, and the society, they accept that policy they have created, that policy they have accepted, that policy they have chosen. So the only chance the people they have, probably they participate in some festivals, in some sports festivals, like Cristiano Ronaldo, because he is in Saudi Arabia. So, well, so that's very good for people. That's very good for people, though. So they have some spaces, some places to exercise their hobby and exercise their interest. That's why I think the relationship between state and people, it comes back, it's of course from top to bottom, and it is never ever from bottom to top. That's why the Saudi, they provide some social welfare in order to buy people's acceptance to give up the right in exercising the political right or individualism and so on.
Okay, great. I see a hand raised from Seljuk.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentations. I want to ask about the fall of Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship in Syria. How do you think this fall will influence or affect the so-called social contract in the Gulf countries? I'm asking all the panelists. Thank you.
It's a great question. Who wants to go first?
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, Tobias.
After Tobias.
Well, thank you. I mean, I can try to answer part of the answer also from my field of expertise when it comes to sustainability, and also maybe to respond a little bit to what Kardo has actually outlined, which is perfectly right. I just want to make here two things. So at first, I think, I mean, we have this kind of welfare gains, but we also have seen that this kind of social contract is actually under pressure. And what is interesting now is that they are trying to make even use of these kind of crises here in terms of, for instance, well, we cannot provide the welfare gains to all our citizens. So this relates also to the citizenship discussion we had, but also in terms of, for instance, climate change and degradation of resources. So we have seen this under the COVID pandemic that, for instance, Saudi Arabia has introduced the taxes and tripled them because of economic decline during the pandemic. So we have certain narratives here that are also used as a justification strategy. We have also seen this, that we have to lift subsidies for water and energy. Well, in the Saudi case, this has not happened because of stronger contestation from the public. But I think that this is also a very interesting finding that we can see that actually this kind of social contract and also the rentier-based social contract, it's actually more flexible than we have assumed before, because it can stretch us a little bit and it can maintain some pressure to the social contract, and it is very strategically adapted to certain and different structural constraints, like, for instance, climate change and so on. So I think that this is also something we have to look for, how these things and how reforms and stuff like this are actually justified under bigger themes like climate change and clean energy technology transitions and so on. Coming now to the fact of Syria, and I had the pleasure of writing a short paper and a policy analysis last year already, where we have seen that the Gulf states have actually created more contact to the Assad regime in terms of new business opportunities and stuff like this. And there had been even some negotiations between energy companies like Aqua Power and Master Power to build renewable energy plants in Syria. So I think they are not really agnostic to the regime. So they just looking out for new business opportunities in order to shift the social contract a little bit more away from, for instance, only selling oil and gas. I think that, well, now since Bashar al-Assad is not any longer in power, we will still see that the Gulf states are trying to make negotiations with a new regime in order, for instance, and this is only now limited to my field, but I could definitely imagine that that they will plan to build new and to construct new energy plants in Syria, to bring Syria also closer to the Gulf states here, to be part of a broader Middle East electricity grid, which is in plan, where, as Thomas has said in the beginning, also again, the Gulf states want to be kind of the energy gravity center here. So I can imagine that they will also use this kind of opportunity to reach out to Syria in terms of creating these kind of new business opportunities of a clean energy transition.
That's great. Kristen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, of course, and one that we really don't know, because this is new situation, it's just so new for all of us to contemplate with this incredible shift in power in Syria. I guess I would agree with Tobias, just that I think the Gulf states will be plodding along the way that they've been doing things, really focused on their economic transformations and looking, to benefits if they're there. But it is interesting to reflect on how this could play out, because if we look at the Gulf states in the model right now, and we think about the social contract, I think both Tomas and Gail really emphasize how right now it's very much top down. This is very much, a ruler based, that then brings in the citizens through issues of sort of obligations and ways that they can contribute. And of course, nationalism is really important in having that frame for ideological frame for that social contract. But in Syria, of course, we've just seen a very bottom-up transition of power, about as definitionally bottom-up as you can imagine. I mean, basically a successful revolution with at least some Islamist characteristics to it. I think we're still trying to understand what the new transitional government looks like, and also, the heavy challenges that it faces to maintain unity in Syria, which has never been too successful at that. But if we were to see something more successful, it would definitely provide a very different model, I think, than what we have in the Gulf states. So we might see new avenues for new kinds of discourse or something of representing a more bottom-up kind of politics.
That's great. Does anyone else? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, I fully agree with what Kristen and Tobias, etc. Said. Maybe one short remark on the question on Syria and the other one on the social contract in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's quite fascinating to see that Saudi Arabia would have been ready to reestablish full diplomatic relations, etc., and they would have been ready to to come up with a full-fledged, policy to bring Syria back into the GCC family, if you wish. Nonetheless, I think for Saudi foreign policy, it's a good news, since any news that is actually leading to a decrease in terms of leverage of Iranian actorness having an impact on the region through proxies is a good news for Saudi Arabia. So they would have been ready to deal with any option, but I think this option is definitely, from the perspective of Saudi foreign policy, the better option. So maybe that's my short remark on Syria. And the other remark, and I'm really grateful that you mentioned it before, Christine, I think it would be wrong to stick to this paradigm of the 2000s or 2010th years. This social contract is not working anymore. And they are all aware of that it's not working anymore. Of course, the Vision 2030 was written by international consultants. I mean, we are aware of that. But they are really trying to promote a different narrative. And this narrative is, of course, promoted from a top-down perspective, but they really try to incorporate, or they really try to take the people with them in sharing this narrative. And this is something you see if you look at how they are trying to re-establish cultural sites, traditional sites. I mean, they really want to have a shared vision on behalf of the ruled and together with the rulers. So this is probably, I think, a really different development we are currently witnessing compared to 10 or 15 years ago. And in this case, I would say that Mohammed bin Salman is really pragmatic in deciding which part of the toolbox he is actually playing with for the sake of regime survival. But the social contract thing is not working. This has to be something else.
Great. Any last words on Syria?
Yes, I think. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think regarding the social contract in Gulf state or in Saudi Arabia, in that case, I think the social contract has been changed since Mohammed bin Salman, he came to power, because he started to for example, killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Who's Jamal Khashoggi? Khashoggi was one of the most important journalists in Saudi Arabia, and he killed him in Istanbul, in Saudi's embassy, consulate in Istanbul. So it was kind of sending a message, a signal to who is against his power. They will pay a heavy price for if they are opposite to bin Salman's let's say reform, his policy, his visions, and he started to for example, many religious scholars, they have been put in jail, they have been in prisons for without any reasons, and also removing ban on females driving a car for Saudi's women. So now they have a right to drive in a car. It was not allowed before he came to power. So I think Mohammed bin Salman, he started to change that principles of social contract in Saudi Arabia, because he is one of, like, let's say, he's not going to use a religion as previous king they did. He tried to, for example, Abraham Accords. Abraham Accord is one of the most important policy in the Middle East, and bin Salman, he tried to use it as one of part of the social contract, al-Adyan al-Ibrahimiyya, as we know as they called it in Arabic. So normalization with the Israel can be also put into that social contract. I think also post 7 October, after Hamas, they attacked Israel, and then Israel attacked Hamas, removing Hamas from power, and then domino effect, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, probably Iraq next will be, and then finally Iran. So I think Saudi, they have prepared themselves for well, we are going to change the principles we created our social contract. Nowadays, we have new factors, we have a new actors, so we have to, let's say, change us. We must be very pragmatism in our social contract. So that's why I don't think removing Assad will have an impact on social contract in Saudi Arabia. As I said, because Mohammed bin Salman, he started his reform, changing of the social contract. So Assad will be, even you have mentioned that Gulf state like UAE started to normalize with Bashar al-Assad. But even they started that relation, they knew that Assad will not be able to come back to power as he did in past, as his father. So, but it was kind of pragmatism in UAE and also Saudi Arabia. But after 7 October, I think we have a new time, we have a new actors, where we have a new powers, we have a new peoples, we have a new players like Mohammed Shia or Jolani in Syria. So I will say that removing Assad will not have a huge impact on the social contract in Saudi Arabia, because they have started before removing Assad for changing of the social contract. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think we are out of time, but thank you so much. And Kristen, I'll take the opportunity later to at a different time to pick your brain about Kuwait and populism and its future. I believe I'm supposed to hand over now to Molly to close up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to say that all of those presentations were so interesting. I've been like sat here taking all the notes for the report, and it's just like things, especially our kind of concluding conversation, it's like new things that you've not really thought about before altogether. It's just amazing. Yeah, so thank you so much for attending. All of the questions as well. Amazing to have that kind of back and forth discussion. And just to mention that we will be having our 19th panel on the 30th of January 2025, which will be on ethnic and sectarian politics and populism in Iraq, Syria, and the Kurdish regions. So we'd obviously love to see everybody there. Yeah, and thank you so much.